Scranton, Pennsylvania. If you know the name at all, you probably know it as the setting of a TV show about a paper company. A punchline. A rust belt also ran. A city people drive past on I-81 without stopping, maybe catching a glimpse of tired brick buildings and a downtown that looks like it peaked sometime before their grandparents were born. Maybe you've heard a politician mention it. They always mention it when they want to sound like they understand working people. Joe Biden's from there, they remind you, as if that's the whole story, as if that explains anything. It doesn't. Because here is what Scranton actually was: the single most important industrial city in the history of the United States that no one talks about anymore. At its peak, the anthracite coal pulled from the mountains surrounding Scranton powered the entire Eastern Seaboard. Not helped power it, not contributed to powering it, powered it. The heat in the homes of Boston, the furnaces of New York, the gas lamps of Philadelphia, the steel mills of a nation building itself out of ambition and raw material. All of it, every glowing window, every clanging factory, every locomotive screaming across a continent, ran on coal that came out of the earth beneath Scranton's feet, and the men who dug it, the boys who dug it. Some of them weren't even 10 years old. This is not a story about decline. This is a story about what happens when a city bets everything on a single industry, wins bigger than anyone thought possible, and then watches that industry drown. Not slowly, not metaphorically, but literally, catastrophically in a single morning. And the world barely notices. Let's start at the beginning. Not the political beginning, not the corporate beginning, the geological beginning. Because the real story of Scranton starts roughly 300 million years ago, in a shallow tropical swamp that once covered northeastern Pennsylvania. Vast forests of ancient trees collapsed into that swamp, layer after layer, compressed over millions of years by the weight of continents shifting above them. Pressure and time transformed those forests into coal, but not just any coal, anthracite, hard coal, the purest, densest, most energy-rich coal on Earth, the kind that burns clean and hot and long, with almost no smoke, the kind that, in the 19th century, was worth more per ton than almost any other substance that came out of the ground, the kind that, once the Industrial Revolution began demanding fuel at a scale the world had never seen, would make the men who controlled the mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania among the most powerful human beings alive. The Lackawanna Valley sits at the heart of the anthracite region. It's a narrow, folded valley, the mountains pressing in from both sides like walls. The coal seams run beneath it at steep angles, some nearly vertical, which made mining it extraordinarily dangerous. The earth didn't give it up easily. It had to be chased, blasted, and clawed out of the rock at depths that could kill a man in a dozen different ways before lunchtime. The valley's first European settlers in the late 1700s knew the coal was there. They could see it cropping out of the hillsides, staining the streams black. But they didn't know what to do with it. Not yet. For decades it sat there, waiting. The valley stayed quiet. Small farms, dense forest, a river running through it called the Lackawanna, cold and clear, fed by mountain springs. That river would become the central character of this story. Not the miners, not the industrialists, not the politicians. The river. Hold that thought. The man who first understood what was buried in these mountains was named William Henry, and he spent years trying to convince anyone who would listen that this hard black rock could be burned. People thought he was wrong. Anthracite was notoriously difficult to ignite. It needed intense heat and sustained airflow before it would catch, unlike the softer bituminous coal people were already using further west. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but too perfect not to include, that Henry's first public demonstration failed so spectacularly that the crowd walked away laughing at him. He kept going. By 1807, he'd figured it out. The anthracite burned, and when it did, it burned hotter and longer and cleaner than anything else available. Word spread. By the 1820s, canal companies were cutting waterways through the mountains to move the coal east. By the 1840s, the railroads arrived, and everything accelerated. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, the DL and W, drove its tracks into the valley in 1851. Almost immediately, the valley stopped being a quiet agricultural backwater and started becoming something else entirely. A machine. An industrial machine of staggering scale and almost hallucinatory intensity. The kind of thing that once you actually look at it clearly in the cold light of what it cost in human terms, becomes genuinely difficult to process. By 1860, Scranton had a population of around 9,000 people. By 1880, it was 45,000. By 1900, it was over 100,000. And it kept going. People didn't just move to Scranton. They flooded it. They arrived from Ireland, fleeing famine and the total economic dismemberment of their country by British policy. They arrived from Wales, from the coal fields of the South, men who already knew how to follow a seam underground and not die. They arrived from Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Italy, Ukraine. Waves of people so dense and successive that whole neighborhoods became essentially transplanted villages, where the first generation barely learned English because they didn't need to, because everyone around them spoke the same language they'd brought across the ocean. These were the people who built Scranton, not the railroad executives, not the coal barons whose names are on the park benches, not the politicians, the men who descended into the earth every morning, and the children. We have to talk about the children. In the mid to late 19th century, the coal industry employed children by the thousands in the Scranton area. Not teenagers. Children. Boys as young as 7 and 8 years old worked as breaker boys, sitting astride fast-moving conveyor chutes of coal, reaching in with bare hands. Gloves were forbidden because they reduced sensitivity. To pick out pieces of rock and slate from the coal before it went to market. The coal moved constantly. The dust was constant. The noise was constant. Supervisors walked the catwalks above with sticks, hitting boys who slowed down or looked away. Their fingers bled every day. There is a photograph taken by Lewis Hine in the early 1900s, part of his documentation of child labor for the National Child Labor Committee, that shows a row of breaker boys at a mine in South Scranton. They are covered in black dust. They are looking at the camera with expressions that are very hard to describe. Not quite defeat, not quite defiance. Something older than either. Most of them are between 8 and 14. Some look younger. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They were paid pennies. This was not an aberration. This was the system. This was how the coal got cleaned. This was how the profits of the industry were protected, by using the cheapest possible labor, by using labor that had no choice, no union, no legal protection, no recourse. And the men underground had it worse. The mines were not safe. They were never safe, and the companies knew it. And they calculated that the cost of compensation to dead miners' families was lower than the cost of the safety improvements that would have prevented the deaths. That calculation was made explicitly in writing in the boardrooms of the coal companies. We have the documents. They exist. They are not secrets. Methane gas explosions, roof collapses, flooding, men buried alive, men drowned, men crushed, men suffocated when ventilation systems failed. Between 1870 and 1950, over 30,000 men and boys died in the anthracite coal mines of Pennsylvania. 30,000 in one industry, in one region, in 80 years. The names are in the records. The names exist, but you don't know them because history doesn't keep the names of the men who died building the prosperity it celebrates. But here's where the story shifts. Because despite all of that, despite the blood and the dust and the dead children, something extraordinary happened in the Lackawanna Valley in the second half of the 19th century. Something that, when you actually look at the numbers, is almost incomprehensible. The valley didn't just produce coal, it produced an industrial civilization. The Scranton iron furnaces, built in the 1840s by the brothers George and Selden Scranton, were among the first successful iron blast furnaces in the country. They used anthracite coal, not charcoal, not coke, but anthracite, to smelt iron ore, which was a technological breakthrough that changed American manufacturing. The rails they produced helped lay the tracks of a dozen major railroads. The prosperity those furnaces generated built the city that bore the Scranton family name. By the 1880s and 1890s, the city had streetcars, not horse-drawn streetcars, electric streetcars. Scranton was one of the first cities in the entire United States to operate a full electric streetcar system. This was not a small thing. This was, at the time, the equivalent of launching a tech startup that becomes the global standard, a small, unglamorous, industrial city leading the world. They had electric lights. They had indoor plumbing. They had department stores and opera houses and hotels. They had a business district that rivaled cities 5 times their size. They had wealth, not evenly distributed, not by a long shot, but present in the city in quantities that built institutions and infrastructure that still stand today, hollow and confused about their own grandeur, unable to quite explain how they got so large. And underneath all of it, every minute of every day, the mines kept going deeper, going further. Going into ground that the engineers increasingly understood was laced through with aquifers, underground water systems of enormous scale and pressure that the coal seams were slowly, silently approaching, year by year, foot by foot. Mining operations that, by the 1940s, had excavated hundreds of miles of tunnels beneath the city, hundreds of miles, beneath the streets, beneath the houses, beneath the parks and the churches and the department stores and the hotels, beneath the river. The Lackawanna River runs directly through the center of the city. By the mid-20th century, the mines had tunneled to within a few dozen feet of the river's bedrock floor in multiple locations. The coal companies knew this. Their engineers knew this. The math was not complicated. They were removing the support structure from beneath a major waterway. What happens when you do that is not a mystery. It is not an unknown. It is, in fact, one of the most predictable things in mining engineering. And they kept going, because the coal was still there, because the market still wanted it, because the same calculation they'd made about the cost of dead miners versus the cost of safety, told them to keep going. And because the alternative was to stop, to leave coal in the ground, to reduce output, to accept lower profits. So they kept going. On January 22, 1959, the Susquehanna River broke through the floor of the Knox Coal Mine in Port Griffith, just south of Scranton. But that's not where the story of Scranton's death begins. That's not even the worst of it. The worst of it is what the city did after, and what it didn't do, and what it became. Part 2. The engine of the story. Descent to understand what happened to Scranton. You have to go underground. Not metaphorically, literally. You have to follow the men down the shaft, the cage dropping fast enough to make your stomach rise into your throat, the temperature changing, the light from the surface shrinking to a pale rectangle above you and then disappearing entirely, and the darkness of the earth closing around you like a fist. You have to stand in that darkness, in that silence broken only by the drip of water and the distant groan of rock under pressure, and understand that this was where the city was actually built. Not on the surface. Down here. In the seams. The anthracite seams beneath the Lackawanna Valley have names. The miners named them the way sailors name currents. With respect, with familiarity, with the knowledge that a name gives you something to hold on to when everything else is trying to kill you. The Baltimore, the Clark, the Diamond, the Dunmore, the Fell, the Holden, the Cane, the Mammoth. The Mammoth Seam was the prize, a coal deposit that in some locations ran nearly 60 feet thick, an almost incomprehensible abundance of pure anthracite sitting in the dark, waiting. The Mammoth Seam alone, across the anthracite region, contained reserves that mining engineers in the 19th century estimated would last centuries. They were wrong about that. Not because the coal wasn't there. It was. But they underestimated how fast industrial civilization would consume it. The geography of the underground was staggering. By the early 20th century, the coal companies operating in and around Scranton had constructed what amounted to a second city beneath the first one, a city of tunnels and chambers and vertical shafts, of rail lines running miles underground carrying coal cars pulled by mules that spent their entire working lives below the surface, animals that were lowered into the mines as young animals and sometimes never came back up until they were too old to work. There are accounts of miners who had worked beside certain mules for so long that the animals knew the route by feel, knew where to stop and start, knew the sound of a bad roof from a good one. When a mule finally came back to the surface after years underground, the sudden brightness of daylight would sometimes blind it temporarily. That detail lodged itself in me when I first read it. The temporary blindness of animals returning from the dark. It felt like a metaphor for the entire city. The tunnel systems weren't built according to a single unified plan. Each colliery, each mine operation, dug its own network, and over time, those networks began to intersect, to share walls, to run parallel and then diverge. The companies were supposed to maintain what were called barrier pillars, solid columns of unexcavated coal left in place between mining operations and between the mines and the surface waterways above. The barrier pillars were not optional. They were structural. They were what kept the underground from collapsing, what kept the water out, what kept the surface from swallowing itself. The coal companies knew this, and then, slowly, over decades, they began mining the barrier pillars. Not all at once, not dramatically. Quietly, incrementally, with the logic of organizations that are watching a resource run out and deciding that short-term extraction is worth long-term structural risk, especially when the long-term structural risk would be paid by someone else, by the miners, by the city, by the future. The process was called robbing the pillars. The miners called it that. The engineers called it retreat mining. Different names for the same thing, pulling out the coal columns that were holding the ceiling up. It was, and remains, one of the most dangerous practices in underground mining. You go in, you take what's left, and you get out before the ceiling comes down. Except sometimes, you don't get out in time. And sometimes what comes down isn't just a ceiling, but an entire water table. Now here's what nobody tells you about the coal industry in Scranton during its peak years. The wealth it generated was extraordinary, and almost none of it stayed in the valley. The major coal and railroad companies operating in the anthracite region were controlled, in large part, by a small network of financial interests centered in Philadelphia and New York. The Reading Railroad, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the Delaware and Hudson, the Lehigh Valley Railroad. By the late 19th century, 6 railroad companies controlled approximately 90% of the anthracite coal trade. 6 companies. 90%. And the men who ran those companies, the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, the men who occupied the leather chairs in the mahogany offices on Broad Street in Philadelphia and Wall Street in New York, those men were not from Scranton. They did not live in Scranton. They did not breathe the coal dust of Scranton. They did not send their children down into the dark. They sent other people's children. The money that came out of the Lackawanna Valley in the form of coal was converted into profits that went east and south, into the capital cities of American finance. What came back to the valley was wages. Just enough wages to keep the men working. Just enough to keep the families fed. Just enough to justify the next shift. The great houses of Scranton, the mansions on Clay Avenue and Monroe Avenue where the mine superintendents and local company managers lived. Those were not the houses of the men who actually controlled the industry. Those were the houses of the management class, the local overseers, the men who were prosperous by the standards of a coal mining city, but who were themselves employees of distant power. The real money, the transformative, generational, institution-building money, was somewhere else entirely. It always was. This is the first wound. The economic structure of the city was colonial from the beginning, a resource colony in its own country. The valley produced something the rest of the nation needed desperately, and the rest of the nation organized itself to ensure that the people doing the producing got as little of the proceeds as possible. The men who fought back against this arrangement were the members of the United Mine Workers of America. The UMWA's history in the anthracite region is one of the most violent, dramatic, and consequential labor stories in American history. And it has been almost entirely forgotten by the mainstream culture that benefited from it. The strikes, the lockouts, the private police forces maintained by the coal companies, the coal and iron police, a private militia essentially deputized by the state of Pennsylvania to protect company property, which in practice meant to beat, arrest, and terrorize striking miners and their families. The Baldwin Felts detectives, the evictions from company-owned housing, where a miner who went on strike could find himself and his family out on the street within days, their furniture on the sidewalk, their children without shelter, in the middle of a Pennsylvania winter. The Latimer Massacre of 1897. This one needs to stop and be said clearly. On September 10th, 1897, a group of approximately 400 striking miners, mostly recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, men who had been in the country for months or a few years, men whose English was limited but whose understanding of injustice required no translation, were marching peacefully toward the Latimer Mine, about 15 miles from Scranton, to call on the workers there to join the strike. They were unarmed. They were carrying an American flag. The Luzerne County Sheriff and a posse of deputies met them on the road. The deputies opened fire. 19 men were killed. 36 were wounded. The dead included men from Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Austria. The youngest was 19 years old. His name was Mike Cheslak. He had been in America for less than a year. The sheriff and his deputies were tried for murder. They were acquitted, every single one of them. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The Latimer massacre accelerated the growth of the UMWA in the anthracite region more than any organizing drive could have. Because the men who had immigrated from Central and Eastern Europe, men who had survived pogroms, who had survived conscription into imperial armies, who had crossed an ocean in steerage with nothing but the clothes they were wearing and the address of a relative who might or might not still be alive. Those men understood, at the molecular level, what organized power looks like when it decides that your life is an acceptable cost of doing business. They organized. The Great Anthracite Coal Strike of 1902 is one of the pivotal events in American labor history, and most Americans couldn't tell you it happened. 147,000 miners walked off the job in May of 1902. The strike lasted 5 months. It threatened to leave the entire Eastern Seaboard without fuel for the coming winter. It was, at that moment, an existential crisis for the industrial economy of the United States. President Theodore Roosevelt, not a man with enormous sympathy for organized labor, was forced to intervene. Not because he wanted to, because the alternative was the lights going out in New York City. The coal companies, led by George Baer of the Reading Railroad, refused to negotiate. Baer sent a letter during the strike that became famous for its breathtaking arrogance. A letter in which he essentially argued that the men who ran the coal companies were doing God's work, and that the miners should trust in their benevolence rather than organizing for their own interests. The letter leaked. It was published in newspapers across the country. It became a symbol of exactly the kind of industrial arrogance that was fueling the labor movement. Roosevelt summoned both sides to Washington. The companies still refused to negotiate. Roosevelt threatened to seize the mines and operate them with federal troops. The companies finally agreed to arbitration. The miners won a 10% wage increase and a reduction in the working day. They did not win recognition of the union. That would take longer. But something had shifted. The federal government had intervened in a labor dispute on the side of the workers. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was the first crack in the wall. What it didn't change was the ground beneath their feet. While the strikes were being fought, while the labor wars were consuming the surface of the valley, the mines were going deeper, always deeper. The easy coal, the coal close to the surface, the coal in thick seams with good roof conditions and manageable water, that coal was largely gone by the early 20th century. What was left required going further from the shafts, further from the fresh air, further into ground that the engineers' surveys were increasingly flagging as compromised. Ground where the water pressure in the surrounding rock was higher than it should be. Ground where the barrier pillars, where they still existed at all, were thinner than regulations technically allowed. The Lackawanna River, running through the center of the city above, had been redirected in places, channeled, bridged, built over. The city had, in some respects, forgotten the river was there. Or rather, it had decided the river was infrastructure, a thing to be managed, routed, controlled, rather than a force, rather than something with its own logic and its own physics and its own patient, indifferent power. The river had not forgotten the mines. Water finds its way. That is the fundamental axiom of hydrology and one of the most dangerous truths in underground mining. You can pump water out of a mine, and the Scranton operations pumped enormous quantities of it, continuously, 24 hours a day, every day. But you are not eliminating the water. You are maintaining a balance. You are running fast enough to stay in place. The moment the pumps slow, the moment a seam gives way, the moment a pillar fails, the water doesn't ask permission. It doesn't send notice. It moves at the speed of physics. And by the middle of the 20th century, the physics were becoming very difficult to argue with. But there was another force eating at the valley's foundations even before the water arrived. The anthracite market was dying. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Slowly, with the grinding inevitability of technological change that doesn't announce itself, but simply arrives. One household decision at a time, across millions of homes and factories and furnaces. The competition came first from natural gas, then from fuel oil, then from bituminous coal, softer, dirtier, but abundant in the coal fields of West Virginia and Kentucky, where the seams were thick and horizontal, and the mining was cheaper and less dangerous. Anthracite's great virtue, its cleanliness, its efficiency, its concentrated heat, stopped being a competitive advantage in a market where cheap fuel was more valuable than clean fuel. The industrial users who had depended on anthracite for decades began switching. The railroads converted from coal to diesel. The home heating market, which had sustained the industry through the long decline of industrial demand, began converting to oil and gas through the 1940s and 1950s. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1917, the anthracite mines of Pennsylvania produced over 100 million tons of coal. By 1950, production had fallen to under 45 million tons. By 1960, it was under 20 million. The direction was unambiguous. The speed was only a question. The industry was not declining. It was dying. And the men who owned the mines knew it, which meant they were extracting as much as possible, as fast as possible, with as little investment in safety and infrastructure as they could justify. Because you don't spend money maintaining an asset you're planning to abandon. You take what you can and you leave. You leave the tunnels. You leave the equipment. You leave the worked-out seams. You leave the people. You especially leave the people. By the early 1950s, Scranton had begun to notice something wrong with its own ground. Not catastrophically wrong, not yet, but notices, signs. The kind of things that, in retrospect, were screaming warnings dressed up as minor incidents. Sinkholes, surface subsidence, houses that developed cracks in their foundations for no apparent reason, streets that developed subtle dips and tilts that the city road crews would fill in without asking too many questions about why they kept coming back. There were areas of the city where you could push a steel rod into the ground and it would drop through into nothing, an underground void left by decades of mining, the rock above it slowly, invisibly giving way. The city knew. The companies knew. The state geological surveys knew. There were reports. There were studies. There were memos. There is a paper trail, if you choose to follow it, that leads from the engineering departments of the coal companies, through the state regulatory offices, through the city government. A trail of documents acknowledging that the situation underground was deteriorating, that the barrier pillars were inadequate, that the proximity of the mines to surface waterways was a structural risk of the first order. Nothing changed. Because changing it would have cost money. Because changing it would have meant slowing extraction. because the men making the decisions were not going to be in those offices much longer anyway. The companies were already beginning the process of quietly divesting, restructuring, preparing for the exit that they could see coming, even if the city couldn't. And then there was Knox Coal Company. Knox was not one of the great old anthracite operators. It was a smaller operation, a company mining the final remnants of coal in areas that the major companies had already largely worked out. Operating in the Wyoming Valley, just south of Scranton. Mining under the Susquehanna River. Their barrier pillar under the river was 40 feet thick. That was what the law required. That was the minimum. And it might have been adequate, if the measurements were accurate. If the coal under the river was where the surveys said it was. If the crew foreman on the night of January 21st, 1959, had stopped when the drill hit something unexpected. He didn't stop, and what happened next didn't just flood a mine, it ended an era. It swallowed a way of life whole. And Scranton, the city on the surface, the city of electric streetcars and labor wars and immigrant neighborhoods and 100 years of hard-won, hard-lost, hard-lived history. Scranton looked down into the hole and began, very quietly, to disappear. Part 3. The boiling point. The day the river came in January 22nd, 1959. The temperature in the Wyoming Valley that morning was below freezing. The Susquehanna River moved dark and heavy between its banks, carrying ice. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and close, the way Pennsylvania winter skies pressed down on the valley like a lid. Men were going to work. The Knox Coal Company's River Slope Mine, located near the village of Port Griffith in Jenkins Township, just south of Wilkes Barre, south of Scranton, deep in the heart of the anthracite region, was operating its morning shift. 12 men went down that morning who would not come back up alive. But the story of what happened that day doesn't begin on January 22nd. It begins years earlier, in a series of decisions so reckless, so nakedly driven by short-term profit over every other consideration, that when you lay them out in sequence, the disaster stops feeling like an accident and starts feeling like a result. Like the predictable, documented, foreseen consequence of choices that were made deliberately by men who understood exactly what they were doing. Let's lay them out. The Knox Coal Company began operations in the Wyoming Valley in the early 1950s. The company was connected to organized crime, specifically to figures associated with the Russell Bufalino crime family, which had deep roots in northeastern Pennsylvania. This is not speculation. This is the conclusion of multiple federal investigations and grand jury proceedings that followed the disaster. The connection between the anthracite coal industry and organized crime in its final decades is one of the most underreported aspects of the industry's history, a story that sits in the court records and the FBI files and the congressional testimony, waiting for someone to look directly at it. The Knox operation was leasing mining rights in areas that had already been heavily worked by previous operators. The coal they were after was the remnant coal, the fragments and pillars left behind when the major companies moved on. This was, by its nature, high-risk mining. You are working in ground that has already been compromised, in tunnels that the previous operators may or may not have documented accurately, with geological conditions that are inherently less predictable than virgin territory. They were mining under the Susquehanna River. The river at Port Griffith ran directly above the mine workings. The law was clear. A barrier pillar of at least 35 feet of solid coal must be maintained between the mine roof and the riverbed. 35 feet of coal is not an enormous margin when you are talking about the combined weight and pressure of a major river above you. but it was considered minimally adequate based on the engineering standards of the time. Knox maintained their barrier pillar on paper. In practice, what was happening underground was something different. The mining was pushing closer to the river than the company's official surveys acknowledged. There are accounts from miners who worked the river slope in the months before January 1959 who reported water seeping into the workings at rates that concerned them. Water that came from above, not from the sides. Water that had the particular quality of river water rather than groundwater. Miners know the difference. They spend their working lives listening to what water tells them underground, because water underground is almost always trying to tell you something bad. Some of those men raised concerns. Some of those concerns reached foremen. What happened to those concerns after that is not entirely clear, but the outcome is, nothing changed. The night of January 21st into the morning of January 22nd, a crew was working in the section of the mine closest to the river. They were mining coal from the area directly beneath the riverbed, in a section where the barrier pillar, what remained of it, was significantly thinner than the legal minimum. How thin? Subsequent investigations concluded that in some places, the coal between the mine roof and the river bottom was as little as 6 feet thick. 6 feet. Between a working mine and a major river. At some point during that shift, a mining machine cut into a section of roof that gave way. The accounts vary slightly. This is the nature of disaster reconstruction, where the people who were present were focused entirely on surviving, and the precise sequence of mechanical events is reconstructed afterward from physical evidence and the testimony of the living. What is certain is that the breakthrough happened fast, not slowly, not with warning. Fast, the way these things always happen when the pressure has been building for years and finally finds its release in a single moment. The river came in. Not as a seep, not as a flood, as a torrent, as a wall, as a roaring, black, ice-cold, unstoppable column of water and silt and riverbed material that hit the mine at a pressure and volume that was essentially instantaneous from the perspective of the men who were underground. The sound, according to survivors, was unlike anything they had ever heard. Not a rush, not a roar, a detonation. The earth itself making a sound it was never supposed to make. And then the water, moving faster than a man could run, filling the tunnels with the inexorable logic of physics that doesn't negotiate and doesn't wait and doesn't care that there are men in its path. 81 men were underground in the Knox mine when the river broke through. 81 men. The evacuation was chaos. The water moved faster than the warning could travel through the tunnel system. Men ran in darkness, in rising water, in the particular terror of underground flooding, which is unlike any other kind of danger, because the exits are vertical, because the water rises toward the only way out, because the further you are from the shaft, the less time you have. 12 men did not make it out. Their names were David Curry, Henry Dudziak, William Gaughan, William Hasty, Daniel Kozlowski, John Lesho, Joseph Stella, John Thomas, Michael Tomko, Harold Tucker, August Wegerson, and Louis Yankowski. 12 men. Fathers. Brothers. Sons. Men who had gone to work that morning in the cold and the dark the way they went every morning. The way their fathers had gone. The way the valley had always worked. The way that seemed permanent and inevitable, and simply the way things were. Their bodies were never recovered. The mine flooded completely in a matter of hours. The Susquehanna poured into the Knox workings, and from there the water spread through the interconnected tunnel systems, that ran beneath the valley. Because remember, these mines were not isolated chambers. They were a network. Miles of tunnels, connecting multiple operations, running under multiple properties, under multiple municipalities. The water didn't stop at the Knox property line. It couldn't. There were no real barriers left to stop it. Within days, mines across the Wyoming Valley were flooding. Operations that had no connection to Knox Coal Company. Operations that had maintained their own safety standards, that had done nothing wrong, found their workings filling with Susquehanna water that had traveled miles underground through the interconnected tunnel systems. 12 mines ultimately flooded. Thousands of miners lost their jobs not because of anything they or their employers had done, but because the water that Knox had let in didn't stop moving. And then something happened that even now is almost impossible to fully process. The Susquehanna River began to drain, not metaphorically. The river itself, the physical river on the surface, began dropping at a rate that alarmed engineers and observers along its banks. The water was going somewhere. It was going underground, into the hole that had opened in its bed. By some estimates, the river was losing water at a rate of tens of millions of gallons per day in the immediate aftermath of the breach. A whirlpool formed on the surface of the river directly above the mine opening. A visible, churning whirlpool in the middle of the Susquehanna, water spinning down into the earth like a drain. People came to look at it. People stood on the riverbanks in the January cold and watched the river disappearing into the ground. It was, by every account, a genuinely terrifying thing to witness. Nature doing something that nature was not supposed to do. The fundamental stability of the physical world suddenly in question. Workers and volunteers dumped materials into the river, trying to plug the breach. Coal cars, mine timbers, thousands of tons of culm, the waste material from coal processing. The culm was dumped by the truckload directly into the whirlpool, an attempt to choke the opening with the same material that had come out of the mines. It took days. It took an almost absurd quantity of material. But eventually, the breach was slowed and then sealed. The river stopped draining. The damage was done. 47 surface acres of land subsided in the aftermath of the disaster. Homes cracked and tilted. Roads buckled. The ground above the flooded workings settled in irregular, unpredictable ways, creating a patchwork of damaged and dangerous property across multiple communities. Families were displaced. Buildings were condemned, and 12 men were sealed in the mine forever. There was no recovery operation. The mine was completely flooded, the tunnels inaccessible, a burial in the earth, a grave that covered multiple square miles. Their families held funerals without bodies. In the following weeks and months, as the investigation began, as the grand jury convened, as the newspapers covered the story and the politicians made their statements, the 12 dead men became a number in the reports. A data point in the reckoning of losses. Their families knew they were more than that. Their families knew. The criminal investigation that followed was one of the most significant prosecutions in the history of American mining. The grand jury indicted numerous Knox Coal Company officials on charges of involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy. When the full investigation was complete, it had reached into organized crime, into corrupt union officials, into complicit state regulators who had looked at the Knox operation's safety records and either hadn't looked hard enough or had chosen not to see what was there. Agostino Canonico and William Hasty, not the miner but a company official of the same name, were among those convicted. The sentences were not severe by any standard that matched the scale of what had happened. Years, not decades. Fines that were insulting in their smallness relative to the damage. But here's what the investigation revealed that goes beyond the Knox operation itself. The inspectors. The state mine inspectors whose job was to enter these mines, measure the barrier pillars, verify the safety records, and certify that operations were within legal standards. Those inspectors had been to the Knox mine. Repeatedly. Their reports are in the record. And their reports, in multiple instances, documented conditions that should have triggered enforcement action, should have triggered shutdown orders, and instead triggered nothing. This was not unusual. This was, by the late 1950s, standard operating procedure across much of the declining anthracite industry. The inspection system had been captured by the industry it was supposed to regulate, not dramatically, not through some obvious corruption, but through the slow, ordinary process by which regulatory agencies that exist in proximity to the industries they oversee begin, over time, to see those industries' survival as their own mandate. The inspectors were not, by and large, villains. They were men operating in a system that had decided the mines needed to keep running more than the mines needed to be safe. That system killed 12 men and flooded an entire valley. But here's the thing about the Knox mine disaster that gets lost in the immediate horror of the event itself. The 12 men who died were not the final victims. They were the first. Or rather, they were the visible ones. The acute ones. The ones who died quickly enough and dramatically enough to be counted. The true final victims were the thousands of miners who lost their livelihoods in the weeks and months after the disaster, as mine after mine flooded and closed. Men who had done nothing wrong. Men who had maintained their own operations according to standard practice, who had followed whatever rules existed, who had simply been working in a tunnel system that turned out to be connected to the tunnel system that Knox had compromised. When the water stopped moving, approximately 5,000 miners in the Wyoming Valley were out of work. 5,000. In a regional economy that was already struggling, in communities that had no economic base beyond the mines, in a valley that had put everything into one industry for 100 years and had never seriously developed an alternative. 5,000 men. And the companies that had made the decisions that led to this, the companies that had mined the barrier pillars, that had falsified the surveys, that had bribed the inspectors, that had organized the whole final reckless extraction, those companies were already in the process of dissolving, declaring bankruptcy, restructuring, leaving. The corporate entities that held the liability were carefully, expertly dismantled, their assets distributed or hidden, their principals moving on to other ventures. The valley got the flood. The companies got away. Now here's what nobody tells you about what the Knox disaster meant for Scranton specifically. Scranton was not Port Griffith. The Knox mine was not directly under Scranton. But the disaster sent a signal through the entire anthracite industry. A signal that was already coming, that everyone in the industry already knew was coming, but that the disaster accelerated from a slow process into a rout. The mine owners who were still operating in the Scranton area looked at what had happened in the Wyoming Valley and made their calculations. The liability exposure was now clear. The regulatory environment was about to get significantly more demanding. The market was already dying. The coal that was left was in ground that was increasingly difficult and dangerous to work. The calculus that had kept them operating, marginal profitability plus minimal regulation plus available labor, was shifting fast. They began to close. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic announcement. But in the years immediately following the Knox disaster, Mine after mine in the Scranton area went through the same process. Reduced operations, workforce cuts, maintenance deferred, equipment not replaced, and then, quietly, without ceremony, closure. The pumps were turned off. When the pumps are turned off in an underground mine, the water begins to rise. It rises slowly at first, and then faster. It fills the lower tunnels, then the middle tunnels, then the upper tunnels. It rises toward the surface, and as it rises, it begins to affect the surface in ways that are not immediately visible, but are absolutely inevitable. The ground shifts. The land above old workings subsides. The water table, disrupted by a century of extraction and drainage, begins to redistribute itself in ways that the surface topography, the streets and the buildings and the parks and the foundations, was never designed to accommodate. Scranton didn't flood the way the Wyoming Valley flooded. It didn't have a single dramatic disaster. It had something in some ways worse. A slow, invisible, underground unraveling that manifested on the surface as economic decline so total and so sustained that it eventually stopped looking like a crisis and started looking like just the way things were. The population figures are a kind of elegy. In 1930, Scranton had a population of 143,000 people. It was the largest city in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. It had hotels and department stores and a downtown commercial district that was, by the standards of a mid-sized American city, genuinely impressive. It had neighborhoods with character, with density, with the particular texture that comes from generations of working people building a life in a specific place. By 1960, the population had dropped to 111,000. By 1980, it was 88,000. By 2000, it was 76,000. By 2020, it had stabilized at around 77,000, roughly half of what it had been at its peak. But the population numbers don't capture what was lost. Population numbers count bodies. They don't count the hardware stores that closed because the miners who were their customers left. They don't count the ethnic clubs and fraternal organizations that folded because the communities they served had scattered. They don't count the particular smell of a bakery that made a specific kind of bread that a specific group of immigrants had brought from a specific village in a specific country. A smell that existed in one building, on one street, in one neighborhood of Scranton, and then one day simply stopped existing. They don't count the languages. The valley, at its peak, held communities speaking Polish and Lithuanian and Welsh and Italian and Slovak and Ukrainian and Yiddish and English in all its regional varieties, a sound environment of extraordinary complexity and richness. Those languages didn't disappear overnight. They faded, they thinned, they became the language of the very old, and then they became memory. There is a particular cruelty to what happened to the men who had spent their lives in the mines and who were now, in their 50s and 60s, suddenly without work. These were men who had no transferable skills in the emerging economy's terms, though that framing is its own injustice, because the skills required to work a deep anthracite mine were in fact extraordinarily sophisticated. Knowledge of geology, of engineering, of gas and water behavior, of explosive materials, of equipment maintenance, of the thousand subtle signals that the earth gives off before it does something terrible. These were not unskilled men. They were men whose skills had no market anymore. The retraining programs that the federal and state governments offered in the 1960s were, by every account from the people who went through them, inadequate to the point of being insulting. A 60-year-old miner being offered a course in basic electronics so he could potentially compete for entry-level manufacturing work was not being helped. He was being managed. He was being made to look like a statistic in a column labeled retraining completions, so that someone in an office in Washington or Harrisburg could report that the transition was being handled. It was not being handled. The men lived out their working years in a valley that was slowly emptying around them. Some of them found work in the garment industry, which had come to Scranton in part because of the same cheap labor and weak union presence that had characterized the mining industry. That industry would also eventually leave, moving south, moving offshore, chasing ever cheaper labor with the same logic the coal companies had always used. But that's a slightly different story, and we'll come back to it. What we need to stay with, right now, in this moment of the story, is the ground. The physical ground of Scranton and the surrounding valley. Because the mines didn't just stop. They didn't seal themselves. They were abandoned. Abandoned with equipment still in them. Abandoned with ventilation systems still in place. Abandoned with tunnel supports that were adequate when men were maintaining them but would not remain adequate indefinitely. Abandoned with the water rising slowly, relentlessly, doing what water does. And beneath the city, the legacy of a century of mining created a condition that the engineers have a name for: undermining. The city of Scranton sits, in significant portions of its area, over ground that is fundamentally compromised. Over voids. Over old workings. Over collapsed tunnels and subsided chambers, and the unpredictable geology of a landscape that has been hollowed and re-waterlogged, and left to find its own new equilibrium. Sinkholes appear in Scranton with a regularity that the city's emergency management office treats as routine. Streets crack, foundations settle, properties in certain zones are essentially uninsurable, or insurable only at rates that make ownership a financial abstraction. The Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement has programs specifically for the abandoned mine land problems of northeastern Pennsylvania. Programs that have been funded and operated for decades, and that have, by the agency's own accounting, addressed a significant fraction of the problem. A significant fraction. Not all of it. Not most of it, in terms of the total volume of underground voids and unstable ground. The problem is, in a geological sense, larger than the resources allocated to address it. The city lives on top of its own undoing. But here is the thing that stops me cold every time I think about it. The men who died in the Knox mine, the 12 men whose bodies were never recovered, are still down there. They have been down there for more than 60 years now. The mine that killed them is flooded, inaccessible, sealed by the weight of the water above and the weight of the earth around. No recovery was ever attempted after the immediate aftermath. No recovery is possible with current technology in any practical sense. They are in the ground of a valley that most of the country doesn't think about. In the ground of an industry that the country has moved past. In the ground of a story that has been, in the way that so many industrial stories are, reduced to a statistic in a report, a footnote in a labor history, a line in an economic analysis of regional decline. 12 names: David Curry, Henry Dudziak, William Gowan, William Hasty, Daniel Kozlowski, John Lesho, Joseph Stella, John Thomas, Michael Tomko, Harold Tucker, August Wegerson, Louis Yankowski. The river swallowed them, and the country moved on. But the story of Scranton's death, the full story, the story of what came after, of what the city became in the absence of the industry that built it, of what was tried and what failed and what the city looks like now. That story hasn't been told yet. Not fully. Not honestly. Part 4. The Reckoning. What comes after. When an industry dies, It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a letter. It just stops and leaves the city holding the wreckage, trying to remember what it was before, trying to imagine what it might become next. Scranton tried everything. In the 1960s, the city chased manufacturing. The garment industry arrived, blouses, dresses, undergarments, carried in on the same logic the coal companies had always used: cheap labor, compliant workforce, low land costs. Women who had been miners' wives and miners' daughters now bent over sewing machines in converted warehouses, doing piecework for companies headquartered in New York. The pay was poor. The conditions were familiar in the worst way, and when the garment companies found labor even cheaper in the American South than in Asia, they left with the same indifference the coal companies had shown. They didn't even turn off the lights. They just stopped coming in one morning. The city turned to government. Federal urban renewal money poured in through the 1960s and 1970s, and what it built was instructive. It built parking lots where neighborhoods had been. It built a highway interchange that cut the downtown off from the river it had always ignored anyway. It built municipal facilities of the particular institutional ugliness of that era, buildings that communicated, without meaning to, that the people who would use them were not expected to feel proud. It built the infrastructure of managed decline. There was a moment, brief, almost cruel in its brevity, when Scranton seemed like it might actually turn a corner. The 1980s brought a small wave of light manufacturing and distribution, companies attracted by the same cheap real estate and available workforce that had always been the valley's pitch to outside capital. Interstate 81 made Scranton genuinely convenient as a logistics hub, within a day's drive of a third of the American population, the boosters said. And they weren't wrong. The geography was real. The highway was real. But geography is not destiny, and the companies that came for cheap labor and low taxes left when they found cheaper labor and lower taxes elsewhere. The calculus that had governed the valley since the first coal company arrived: extract value, minimize cost, exit when margins compress, didn't change just because the commodity changed from coal to warehouse labor. The valley kept offering itself up, and capital kept taking what it needed and moving on. The political story of Scranton's decline is, in its own way, as brutal as the industrial one. The city became a symbol, a useful symbol, deployed by politicians from both parties who needed to gesture toward working-class America without actually doing anything for it. Every election cycle brought candidates who mentioned Scranton, who invoked its history, who stood on its streets and made promises about manufacturing jobs and infrastructure investment and the dignity of working people. The promises were made in good faith, sometimes. They were made cynically, often. Either way, they weren't kept at the scale the valley needed, because the scale the valley needed, the actual reconstruction of an economic base capable of sustaining a mid-sized city that had lost its foundational industry. That was a project of a complexity and cost that no election cycle could contain, and no politician wanted to own the failure of. So the symbol persisted. Scranton the underdog. Scranton the forgotten. Scranton the place that represents everything that went wrong with American industrial policy. The symbol persisted. The city emptied. What the population loss did to the physical fabric of Scranton is something that has to be seen to be understood, but I'll try to describe it. A city built for 143,000 people and inhabited by 77,000 has too much of everything. Too many houses, too many commercial buildings, too many schools, too many churches, too many miles of water main and sewer line and electrical infrastructure serving a demand that is roughly half of what the system was designed for. The cost of maintaining that infrastructure, the per capita cost, divided among a tax base that keeps shrinking, is ruinous. Cities in this condition face a choice that isn't really a choice. Raise taxes on the people who remain, driving more people to leave, or cut services, making the city less livable, which also drives people to leave. Scranton has cycled through versions of both options for 50 years. It has been in and out of fiscal distress so many times that the state of Pennsylvania created a specific designation. Financially distressed municipality that Scranton has occupied for decades. It declared fiscal emergency in 2012. City employees had their pay cut to minimum wage temporarily, while the courts worked out the finances. The people who stayed through all of this, and many people do stay, have built lives and businesses and communities in Scranton through the whole long decline. Those people carry a weight that outsiders consistently underestimate. Staying in a place that the world has decided is over requires a specific kind of stubbornness, a refusal to accept the verdict, a love of place that persists even when the place keeps breaking your heart. That stubbornness is the valley's one inexhaustible resource. It is also sometimes what prevents the reckoning that might actually produce change. The mines left one more legacy that the city is still living with: acid mine drainage. The water that fills the old workings, hundreds of miles of flooded tunnels throughout the region, is not clean water. It is water that has been in contact with sulfide minerals in the coal and the surrounding rock for decades. Water that has become acidic. Water that carries dissolved iron and aluminum and manganese and other metals in concentrations that make it toxic to aquatic life. This water finds its way to the surface. It enters the streams and rivers of the valley through seeps and outflows, tinting the water orange and red with iron oxide, killing the aquatic ecosystems that would otherwise inhabit these streams. The Lackawanna River, the same river that ran cold and clear when the first European settlers arrived in the valley, the river that the mines crept toward for a century, is still, in sections, affected by acid mine drainage from the abandoned workings beneath it. The river that the mines approached from below is now poisoned by what the mines left behind. There is something in that specific irony that captures the entire story. Part 5. The final irony. The city that became a punchline: Scranton, Pennsylvania. If you know the name at all, you probably know it as the setting of a TV show about a paper company. We've come full circle. And that's exactly the problem. The Office ran for 9 seasons. It made Scranton, in a specific cultural sense, famous. The kind of fame that is almost worse than obscurity, because it replaces the actual history with a brand. Tourists come to Scranton now to visit filming locations that weren't even filmed there. They take photographs in front of a building meant to evoke a paper company that never existed, in a city whose real story, the coal, the blood, the labor wars, the 12 men still in the ground, they know nothing about. The show isn't cruel. It isn't malicious. It's just indifferent to the reality underneath it. The way the city built over the mines was indifferent to what was happening beneath its streets. The metaphor writes itself. The tourism board embraced it. Of course they did. When your city has been in fiscal distress for 40 years and a television show makes your name recognizable, you use it. You put up signs. You create walking tours. You sell branded merchandise. You do what every post-industrial city does when culture offers you a lifeline. You grab it with both hands, and you don't ask too many questions about what it costs. What it costs is the story. The real story. The one about the men who went underground every morning and didn't always come back. The one about the children with bleeding fingers picking slate from coal in the freezing dark. The one about the Latimer Massacre and the 1902 strike and the labor wars that helped create the American middle class. The one about the 12 names: David Curry, Henry Dudziak, William Gaughan, William Hastie, Daniel Kozlowski, John Lesho, Joseph Stella, John Thomas, Michael Tomko, Harold Tucker, August Wegzin, Louis Yankowski, still down there, in the flooded dark, 65 years later. That story doesn't sell merchandise. There are people in Scranton working to preserve what remains. The Anthracite Heritage Museum in nearby Scranton holds artifacts and oral histories of the mining era. The Lackawanna Coal Mine tour takes visitors underground in the actual workings of a former mine, gives them a physical sense of what the darkness and the cold and the close rock walls actually feel like. These are not small things. These are acts of resistance against forgetting, but they are operating against a current that runs the other way. The current of a culture that processes industrial history as nostalgia, as aesthetics, as vintage photography, as the pleasant melancholy of looking at black and white images of men in hard hats, without reckoning with what that history actually cost, without asking who paid, without sitting with the discomfort of understanding that the prosperity of American industrial civilization was built on a specific transaction, that certain people in certain places would bear the full physical cost of extraction so that everyone else could have heat and light and steel and railroads and the infrastructure of modern life. That transaction was not disclosed. It was not negotiated. It was imposed by geography, by poverty, by immigration status, by the simple, brutal fact that the people doing the work had no other options, and the people profiting from the work had every option. The ground beneath Scranton is still moving, not dramatically, not in ways that make the news usually. But the sinkholes still open, the foundations still shift. The acid mine drainage still colors the streams orange. The Office of Surface Mining still has northeastern Pennsylvania on its active remediation list. The problem left by a century of extraction is not solved. It is being managed. Slowly, partially. With the chronic underfunding that characterizes every program designed to clean up after industries that no longer exist, and therefore have no lobby and therefore have no political constituency beyond the people who live with the consequences. The people who live with the consequences are still there. They are stubborn. They are proud. They are, in the specific way of people whose identity was forged in an industry defined by physical danger and collective solidarity, deeply resistant to being told their story is over. Their story is not over. But it has been buried under a TV show, under political symbolism, under the comfortable national narrative that treats places like Scranton as object lessons in economic change, rather than as evidence of a specific, traceable, documented set of decisions made by specific people who chose profit over people, chose extraction over stewardship, chose the quarterly return over the 100-year consequence. Those decisions have names attached to them. Those names are in the records. The character spine of this story, the single trait that runs through every moment of it, from the first drill bit into the first seam to the whirlpool on the Susquehanna to the TV show Tourists, is not greed, though greed is everywhere in it. It is not stubbornness, though the valley has that in abundance. It is expendability. The belief never stated, always operative, that the people doing the work were expendable, that the ground they worked and lived on was expendable, that the city they built was expendable, that the history they made was expendable, replaceable by a more convenient story, a funnier story, a story that didn't require anyone to feel responsible for anything. The Breaker Boys were expendable. The strikers shot at Latimer were expendable. The 12 men in the Knox mine were expendable. The 5,000 miners who lost their livelihoods when the water spread were expendable. The city itself, in the calculus of the companies that built it and the culture that has since ignored it, expendable. And here is the final irony, the one that closes the circle completely. The coal that was pulled from beneath the Lackawanna Valley, the anthracite that heated a nation, that powered the furnaces of American industrial civilization, that killed tens of thousands of men and boys over 8 decades of extraction, that coal is gone. It cannot be unburned. The energy it contained was consumed, converted to heat and motion and the infrastructure of a modern society that has long since moved past it. The valley gave everything it had, and what remains is the ground, scarred, subsided, acid-laced, still shifting, and the people who stayed, and the names of the men who are still in it, and the sound of a river running over rock that was hollowed out beneath it for 100 years and is still, slowly, finding its new shape. The river is still there. The Lackawanna, running through a city that forgot it, mattered until the mines reminded everyone, in the most brutal possible way, that water and earth follow their own logic, not the logic of profit margins or quarterly reports or the decisions made in mahogany offices in Philadelphia and New York. The river doesn't know it's in a TV show's establishing shot. The river just runs, over the ground where the coal was, over the men who dug it, over everything that was taken and everything that was left behind.